They ask me sometimes why I never trained another student, why I spent the last 30 years teaching theory to initiates who would go on to study under someone else, why I never took a Padawan of my own after Reva, after the trials, after all the years I had left that others didn't. I used to have a long answer for that, a careful answer, the kind that touched on grief and responsibility and the nature of the teacher-student bond, and why some wounds change the shape of everything that comes after them. I refined that answer over years until it was almost convincing. Now I just say, I was on Korreth, and anyone who knows what happened on Korreth stops asking. I was 23 years old. That matters. I want it on record at the start of this account because I need you to understand that everything that follows, every instinct I trusted, every desperate and sometimes stupid thing I did, every calculation I made under conditions no training room had ever replicated, all of it came from someone who was still young enough to believe that preparation was sufficient, that the order had equipped us for whatever the frontier might produce, that the gap between what we knew and what existed out there was a gap that could be bridged by more study, more practice, more time at the forms until the forms were reflexive. That 6 trained operatives, one a master with 20 years of active fieldwork behind him, constituted a force the galaxy would have difficulty surprising. I was wrong. We were all wrong. But I was young enough to be wrong in a way that had not yet been tested, which meant I walked into that canyon with a confidence that had not yet learned what confidence costs when it meets something that was built specifically to extinguish it. My name is Kale Davin. I am 53 years old. I was assigned to Master Joran Seld's scouting cadre as the junior Padawan, which was my official designation on every mission manifest and briefing document associated with the Korreth expedition. Junior Padawan, mission assigned, subordinate role, expected to observe and support and learn. I had passed my first 3 trials. I had trained under Seld for 4 years and under the Order for 14 before that. I had seen real combat in 2 engagements on border worlds and had acquitted myself adequately in both. I thought I understood the difference between sparring and fighting. That understanding was incomplete in ways I could not have articulated then and can barely articulate now, 30 years and a great deal of reflection later. Let me tell you about the 6 of us. Every one of them deserves to be recorded here as a full person, not a casualty designation or a name on a memorial wall. They were my colleagues and my teachers, and after a fashion that the formal language of the Order doesn't quite have words for, my family. They are owed the specificity that comes with being known. Master Joran Seld, 51 years old at the time of Korreth, lean through the torso, gray at his temples, with the kind of hands that develop after decades of grip work, thickened at the palm, quick in the fingers. He did not raise his voice in training. In 4 years under his instruction, I heard him shout exactly once, and that was on Korreth itself in the last minutes of the fight, and what he shouted was my name, and the reason he shouted it was the last lesson he ever taught me. He was a teacher who worked by asking questions rather than supplying answers. You would come to him with a problem, a form you couldn't execute cleanly, a theoretical scenario that didn't resolve the way the text suggested it should, and he would look at you with those quiet gray eyes and say, "What do you think the difficulty is?" He would keep asking until you found it yourself, because he believed, and was correct to believe, that understanding arrived at by the student is understanding that stays. I found this maddening at 23. I have found it invaluable every year since. Knight Arev Moss, 40 years old. She had served on border worlds for most of her active career, which in practical terms meant she had spent 2 decades dealing with situations that weren't covered in any manual, and had survived them through a combination of skill and the particular attentiveness of someone who has already been in enough genuine danger to take it seriously. She was quiet in the way that experienced fighters are quiet, not reticence, not reserve, but the stillness of someone who is perpetually listening to something just beneath the level of ordinary noise. In a group setting, she was the last to speak and the first to notice. I trusted her more than I trusted anyone else in that expedition, and I trusted Joran Seld very much, which should give you some sense of what that means. I want to put that in writing. I want it on record that Arev Moss was the most capable person I have ever stood beside, in that canyon or any other. And what she did in those last minutes was something I have spent 30 years measuring everything else against. Knight Bren Sarrow, 38. Large, not bulky but genuinely large, the kind of person who takes up space in a room and doesn't apologize for it. He had a habit of filling silence with whatever was currently occupying his mind, which on the transport to Korreth meant a long and detailed account of a card game I did not know, and he subsequently taught me, losing 3 rounds in a row to me before revising his understanding of how quickly I learn games, which was one of the only times on that transport anyone laughed. He had a specific gesture before a fight, rolling both shoulders, a small private preparation that he probably wasn't aware he did. I had watched him do it 100 times in the training hall. On Korreth, I kept watching for it in the chaos, looking for that gesture the way you look for a landmark when you are disoriented. I don't know if he got the chance to do it. I don't know if it would have mattered. I know that he was still alive when I ran, and that his voice was the last thing I heard in that canyon, and that he was still fighting in the only way left available to him, which was to keep breathing and let me know it. Knight Ussa Vorn, 34. The best technical fighter in our group by a margin that became undeniable any time you watched her spar. Her footwork was something that defied the ordinary language of technique. It was too specific and too personal to call it anything but hers, and watching her move in a real fight was, even under the worst circumstances imaginable, something like watching a language spoken perfectly. She had trained in a lineage that most of us knew only academically, one that emphasized close-range engagement and the geometric compression of fighting space, and she had a way of explaining the principles that made them sound obvious in retrospect. She told me once, in a real fight, the first thing you lose is distance, so you might as well train as if you never had any. She told me that in the common room of the transport, 2 days before we reached Korreth, and I have thought about it nearly every day since, because she was right in a way she had no way of knowing she was about to demonstrate. And Senior Padawan Dal Rain, 27. He had 4 years on me in rank, and he was appropriately aware of this, though not unkindly so. He was not a person who used seniority as a weapon, just as a fact, the way you might note that you're taller. He had been told for long enough that he was exceptional that it had become part of how he understood himself, which is not a character flaw in a young person so much as a developmental stage that experience eventually corrects. He was talented. He deserved the confidence. He had simply not yet encountered anything that moved faster than his talent could process, which is true of most people until it isn't. And then me, Kale Davin, Junior Padawan, the one writing this account 30 years later, which says everything about the randomness of survival and very little about hierarchy of capability, because I was not the strongest or the most skilled or the most experienced person in that canyon, and the fact that I am here and they are not is not an accounting I have ever been able to make sense of in the way humans instinctively want to make sense of things. The mission briefing was lean because the intelligence was lean. A remote planet in an outer system that had no permanent population, no registered traffic, no catalog entry in any strategic or commercial database of consequence. Korreth was rock and canyon, and a mineral-heavy atmosphere that made the sky look like dirty glass. The reason it had been flagged was an anomaly in a survey drone sensor package, energy signatures, that didn't match anything geological activity patterns that suggested organized behavior, structured and repetitive in a way that implied intent. The Council had evaluated the intelligence and classified it as low priority but worth investigating. 6 of us to go down, assess the source of the signatures, collect data, and report back. Standard scouting protocol, the kind of mission that runs without incident 9 times in 10. We were the 10th. I have been asked whether there were warning signs, whether anything on the transport, or in the briefing, or in the first minutes on the ground, suggested that we were walking into something different from what the mission documentation described. The honest answer is no, or more precisely, the honest answer is that there were no warning signs we were equipped to read as such. The sensor anomalies in retrospect look like what they were: evidence of a single entity moving through a structured training protocol, practicing routines, running drills. At the time, with no reference point for that interpretation, they looked like what the survey team's initial report suggested: possibly geological, possibly equipment artifact, possibly something organic, but probably nothing that required more than 6 people to assess. 6 people, we had been told, was thorough. The transport journey was 2 days. I spent portions of it in the briefing materials, portions sparring with Dahl in the cargo hold, and portions in the common space with Bren, who was, as I have said, a person who filled silence. He was good company. He had strong opinions about navigation routes in the outer systems that he shared in considerable detail, and about the relative merits of different field ration manufacturers, and about the card game he taught me on the first evening, which he was convinced was a game of skill, and which I rapidly demonstrated was primarily a game of memory, to his considerable irritation. Arev said almost nothing for 2 days, which was normal for her. She sat in the forward observation bay for long stretches and looked at the transit display. On the second afternoon, I brought her a cup of tea. The transport had a small heating unit and a limited but functional selection, and she accepted it without turning from the display, which was as close as she came to acknowledging that I had done something considerate. We sat there for a while together, and I looked at the stars and thought about what she was probably thinking about, which was the mission, and what I should have been thinking about, which was also the mission, but which I was mostly not thinking about because I was 23 and had not yet developed the habit of sustained pre-mission focus that experience eventually installs. She said, eventually, the signatures are too regular. I didn't ask what she meant. I wasn't sure she was talking to me so much as thinking out loud, but she went on. Natural phenomena don't move that way. Repeating cycles at those intervals suggest intent, something that knows what it's doing and is doing it repeatedly. She was quiet for a moment. That's not a geological event. The briefing mentioned organic possible explanation, I said. Yes, she picked up her cup. Keep your exits in mind when we're on the ground. I thought about that conversation a great deal in the hours between the canyon and the hyperspace jump. Arev had read the intelligence correctly, 2 days out, with the information available to everyone on that transport. She had pulled the right thread from it and shared it with me in terms I could have acted on if I had been paying the right kind of attention. I hadn't been. Not because I was careless. I had taken the briefing seriously. I had done the preparation work. But because I was 23 and had not yet learned to sit with the possibility of something genuinely unprecedented and let that possibility reorder my priors. That is also something Korreth taught me. We were briefed and prepared and competent, and we went in with the confidence of people who have been trained well. What the training had not given us, could not have given us, because you cannot train for what you have not encountered, was the particular humility of knowing that the universe is not bounded by what has been catalogued. We landed at dawn on the second day after dropping out of hyperspace. The light on Korreth was wrong from the moment I stepped down the ramp, diffuse, flat, filtered through a high particulate layer that smeared the sun into a broad gray-white band across the sky, and eliminated the clean shadows that tell you where things are in relation to each other. The canyon system we'd been tasked to investigate ran roughly north to south through a formation of dark fractured stone, walls rising 40 meters on each side of a dry riverbed. The mineral smell of the air was sharp and specific, something between copper and old ash, and it stayed in the back of the throat long after you stopped noticing it consciously. Seld moved us into a standard patrol spread without breaking stride from the ramp. Arev on point, 8 meters ahead. Bren and Ussa on the flanks, maintaining parallel positions to either side of the riverbed's center line. Dahl and I behind Seld, close enough to communicate without relaying, far enough not to cluster. I remember looking at the formation and thinking, textbook. I remember thinking we were doing this correctly. That is the thing about correct procedure in genuinely novel circumstances. It is still correct, and it is still insufficient, and both of those facts are true at the same time. We had been in the canyon approximately 40 minutes, long enough to have covered the first significant curve in the riverbed, long enough for the entrance to be out of sight behind us, when Arev held up a fist and we stopped. She had found Torval in a crevice 3 meters up the East Canyon wall. Torval was a member of the survey team that had originally flagged the anomalies. He should not have been there. The official record showed his team had withdrawn 2 weeks prior, mission complete, data filed and transmitted. He had not withdrawn. He had gone to ground in that crevice, and he had been there for 6 days, which you could see in him the moment he dropped down to the riverbed. The particular diminishment of someone who has been running on fear and very little else for longer than the body tolerates gracefully. He had lost one member of his team to something in the northern tributary. He had lost another to whatever it was that had followed them from the initial survey site. He had no clear description, no sensor data, no physical evidence beyond the absence of 2 people who had been present and then were not. When Arev asked him to describe what he had seen, he got halfway through a sentence and stopped, not from unwillingness, from some difficulty in making the words fit what his memory was carrying. "What did it look like?" Arev said. She had the patience for this kind of interview, the ability to hold the space open without filling it. Torval thought for a moment. His eyes were doing something involuntary, a slight lateral movement that suggested he was seeing something other than the canyon in front of him. "Like a man," he said, "except it moved wrong, like it knew where it was going before it decided to go there." Seld had us at a perimeter while he ran a longer debrief. I was 20 meters west of the main group, positioned against the canyon wall at a point where the stone jutted out slightly and gave me a partial sightline toward the northern tributary. The silence in that canyon was peculiar. I had expected acoustics that carried sound, stone walls, closed space, the physics of echo. Instead, the quiet felt absorbed, pressed down. As if the canyon were holding its breath for reasons it hadn't shared with us yet. I caught movement at the east rim. High up, where the stone crumbled into a ragged overhang maybe 40 meters above the canyon floor. Something had been present and then was not, the absence registering before I'd cleanly identified the presence. I keyed my comm. Kale, east wall, upper rim. Movement, brief, possibly visual artifact. Arev came back immediately, defined. Negative, gone before I could establish shape or size. A pause of 2 seconds, hold position. Then Torval made a sound, not a scream, not even a shout, just a short, sharp exhalation, the sound of someone who has stopped breathing involuntarily, and the world became very different very fast. The thing descended the east wall without handholds. That was the detail that reordered everything. 40 meters of near-vertical stone, fractured and irregular, and it came down as if the wall were a preference it had decided to decline, not climbing, not repelling, something that moved with the deliberate fluid logic of water finding its own level, as if gravity were a rule it had reviewed and found inapplicable. By the time I had fully processed what I was seeing, it was already on the canyon floor. And the red light was already there, 2 parallel bars of it, a double-ended weapon I had encountered only in historical texts and training simulations, and Bren was down. He was not dead. I want to establish that clearly. Bren Sarrow was not dead. He was on the canyon floor with one hand pressed against his left side and the other braced to keep himself from going flat, and he was swearing in a sustained low stream, which was the most welcome sound I can remember hearing in my life, because it meant he was breathing, and it meant he was still in the fight in the only way currently available to him. The thing, the predator, which is what I will call it in this account because That is what it was. Whatever technical designation exists in whatever restricted archive was built around its existence, had not paused after putting Bryn down. It had already shifted to Ussa. And Ussa Vorn was doing something remarkable. She was holding her ground. I need to take a moment with that statement because I am not sure the weight of it is obvious from the outside. The Predator had just moved through Bryn Sarrow, a large, experienced, exceptionally capable fighter, in the space of time it takes to draw a full breath. It had come off a 40-meter wall without slowing down. It was carrying a weapon class that requires a specific and intensive school of practice to counter, and it was using that weapon at a speed, and with an economy that suggested the practice was, from its perspective, complete. And Ussa Vorn was holding her ground. She was not winning. She was not holding even. She was buying time, and she knew it was buying time, and she bought it anyway with every technical tool she had. The footwork her lineage had spent generations refining, the close-range geometry she had described to me on the transport as if it were obvious, the weight reading she had been doing her entire career. She stripped herself of everything unnecessary and gave the Predator the full, undivided attention of her best fighting. It bought 8 seconds. I want that stated plainly so that no one who reads this account mistakes my precision for a slight. 8 seconds against that thing was not a small achievement. It was an act of will and skill and stubbornness that I am not sure I could have replicated, and it is the reason that, when Seld and Arev hit it simultaneously 8 seconds in, they did so from positions that had some chance of being effective, rather than positions that were simply the closest they could get. The dual assault was the right call, the only call. 2 experienced fighters who had worked together long enough to understand each other's vectors, pressing from angles the Predator would have to split its response to cover. I felt the force concentration from where I stood, the particular attentiveness of people who have done this for decades, drawing on something that goes beneath reflex into something harder to describe, the place where training and instinct and will have merged into a single continuous thing. For a moment they had it, a genuine moment, long enough to constitute real pressure, long enough for the specific and terrible hope to rise in my chest that we might actually. I need to stop here and describe what the Predator looked like, because the official mission reports use language that sanitizes the reality of it in ways that I think serve the report's purposes rather than the truth. Height approximately 2 meters. Lean through the torso and the limbs with the kind of density that doesn't photograph accurately. It looked lighter than it was until it moved, and when it moved you recalibrated everything. Facial tattoos that were not decoration. The pattern was too precise for that, too deliberate, the kind of marking that means something specific in whatever system of meaning it had been raised in or built around. Its eyes were yellow, or appeared yellow in the canyon light, and the thing about its eyes was not their color but their quality. The alertness in them was not the alertness of a creature reading a situation. It was the alertness of a creature that had already read the situation and was now running projected models of where the situation was going. You could see, when you looked at it, that it was always 3 moves ahead of the current moment. The double-ended weapon it carried was a specific choice, a choice designed around a specific problem. How do you fight multiple opponents simultaneously while maintaining offensive pressure at every angle? The weapon's design solved that problem. Watching it in use was watching a theoretical solution become a physical reality in real time, and the gap between theory and practice in that weapon's application was, in the hands of the Predator, effectively 0. I had practiced against the weapon form in simulations. Every student in the Order practiced against every weapon form they might encounter, including archaic and exotic ones. The simulation had told me the relevant things: angles of attack, guard positions, the particular vulnerabilities created when one end of the weapon commits and the other is temporarily less active. What the simulation had not told me and could not have told me was the specific experience of watching that weapon move at the speed the Predator moved it. The speed was not technically unprecedented. I had sparred against fast opponents. I had reviewed recordings of fast engagements. The speed was unprecedented in combination with the precision. Fast fighters make compensating errors. They overextend. They sacrifice accuracy for velocity. The Predator did neither. It was fast and precise simultaneously, in a way that left no exploitable gap between the two. Seld and Arev pressed it for 11 seconds before the adaptation. And then it adapted. That is the word, adapted. Not after a protracted exchange, not after the kind of sustained pressure that forces a fighting system to revise itself over the course of a long engagement. In the space between two exchanges, the gap that exists between one committed action and the next, it changed its footwork, changed its grip position, changed the angle of its approach to account for the dual-threat geometry Seld and Arev had been exploiting. As if it had filed the problem during the fight itself, and resolved it in the same moment, at speed, under load, without the process requiring any of the conscious resources that problem-solving requires in a human being. That is what I mean when I say it was built. That is what I mean when I say it was finished in ways we were not. Dahl was pressing its flank by then, which should have helped and did help briefly before he went down. I did not see exactly what happened to Dahl, and I am not going to speculate. He was alive afterward, I know that much, I heard him, and the formal reports confirm he was recovered from the canyon floor by the team sent 6 weeks later. What I know is that he was fighting, and then he was not. I had been running since Bren fell. The thing about being the junior Padawan in that kind of fight is that you are, in the hierarchy of threats, the least significant element in the space. Everything around me was more experienced, more capable, more likely to do meaningful damage. The Predator's attention was a finite resource, and in that first exchange it had distributed that resource among 5 threats, and I was the smallest one. Not invisible, nothing in that canyon was invisible to it. I am quite sure of that, but small enough to operate in the gap between its primary focus and its peripheral management. I closed the distance while it was engaged with Seld and Arev and Dahl. I hit it on the left flank while Dahl occupied its forward attention, a committed cut, full extension, not a probe. I connected. I want to be precise. I landed a real hit, not a redirect or a deflect, but an actual committed strike from an angle it had not been fully covering, and for the length of time it takes to blink, I thought it had mattered. It had, in fact, mattered, just not in the way and at the speed I needed it to. The Predator calculated the hit as acceptable. That is the only way I can describe what I saw in its response. It turned out of my line of attack not to avoid or minimize the damage, but in the course of its next committed movement, as if the question of the hit had been weighed and found wanting against the question of what that movement was meant to accomplish. It rotated to catch me with a force push that arrived with no preparatory telegraphing, no wind-up, no indication that it was incoming until the air in front of me had developed a sudden and forceful opinion about where I should be. Where I should be, according to that opinion, was against the West Canyon wall. I hit stone hard enough to put gray at the edges of my vision, and slid down the face to the riverbed with my left shoulder informing me, in terms that were impossible to misinterpret, that something had given that was not meant to give. I sat at the base of the wall with the pain building from a shock spike to a sustained deep throb, and tried to re-establish whether I still had a weapon in my hand. I did, that was something. I want to describe what it is like to be the last person standing in a fight you are losing, injured in a way that has removed half your capability, watching the remaining capable people get worn down one by one. It is not what the training films suggest. In the training films there is a clarity to it. The camera finds the hero, and the hero finds something, some resource, some realization, and the finding of that thing reorganizes the situation. In reality, the reorganization does not happen. What happens is that you sit against a canyon wall with a destroyed shoulder, and you watch people you care about in a fight they are not winning, and there is no realization. There is only the assessment of what you have left, which is not much, and the assessment of what you can still do with it, which is less than you need but more than nothing. The mineral smell of the air was stronger at ground level. I had not noticed that before. Copper and old ash, thicker against the canyon floor, as if the stone itself were exhaling it. The detail stuck in my mind with the irrelevant clarity that adrenaline sometimes assigns to useless information while withholding it from things you actually need to know. I looked up the canyon from the floor. The fight was 20 meters north and pulling further. Through my narrowed vision, I could see Seld and Arev still upright, still engaged. Dahl was somewhere to my left at the edge of my sightline, not moving in the way that might mean incapacitation or might mean stillness by choice. Bren behind me was still making noise, which I clung to. Ussa was in the shadow of the east wall, not moving, and I did not look at her for longer than a moment because looking cost something I could not budget for right now. I assessed myself the way Seld had taught me to assess myself in combat, sequentially, without judgment, purely informational. Left arm non-functional, right arm intact, legs operational, saber in right hand active, force connection present but attenuated, stress and shock damping the clarity of it, the way a radio loses signal in heavy weather. I was not going to win a clean engagement against the predator one-handed. I had already demonstrated that. I was not going to contribute meaningfully to the fight as a conventional element. I started thinking about unconventional ones. I started moving north, one working arm and two legs, and whatever the force was willing to offer a 23-year-old Padawan in the worst situation of his life. The canyon had a tributary, east-facing narrow, entered about 10 meters north of the main fight's current position. I had cataloged it on the way in because cataloging exits is something Seld had drilled into me until it was involuntary. In any new environment within the first 60 seconds, identify the routes that aren't the one you came in on. I had noted the tributary as too narrow for tactical use, which remained true. But the walls of the tributary were manageable, and the tributary opened at the canyon rim about 6 meters above the main fight's current position. Height is a force multiplier. I was a 23-year-old Padawan with one arm and no tactical options remaining that didn't rely on surprise, and height and surprise were the same thing here. I went up the tributary wall with my right arm doing the work and my legs, and the force filling in for what my left couldn't manage. The pain in my shoulder was a sustained blaze that I breathed around and did not look at directly, the way you avoid looking at the sun. I came out on the east rim on my stomach and looked down. Below me, Seld was on one knee. He had both hands on the canyon floor, one wrapped around his saber hilt and one flat against the stone, keeping himself vertical through something that was no longer physical. His face in the flat gray light was the color of old ash. I could see 2 cuts from where I was, the particular dark evidence of wounds that had been made and weren't finished making themselves known yet. He was breathing and conscious, and there was something in his posture that was not surrender, would never be surrender. I had known this man for 4 years, and I understood his posture the way you understand a language you have spoken long enough that you stop knowing you know it. Arev had stepped between him and the predator. She was still there. She should not have been still there. Every calculation I had access to in that moment said she should not have been still there. She was working with a damaged weapon. I could see it. A hairline fracture in the hilt that made the blade flicker at its base every time the guard caught an edge-on strike. And she had taken hits I could see the evidence of in how she was moving, small compensations in her left side that weren't there at the beginning of the fight. She was still there. I have spent 30 years trying to understand what I saw in those next seconds, trying to find the right framework for it, and I keep arriving at the same place. Arev Moss in those moments was fighting with a simplicity that the predator had not accounted for. Not a technique, not a system. The complexity had burned away. Every elaboration and refinement and contextual adjustment that constitutes sophisticated combat had been consumed by the previous minutes, and what remained was something older than training. She had stripped herself down to a single piece of information. There is a person behind me, and I am not going to move. The predator hesitated. A fraction of a second, less than a breath. I cannot prove that hesitation. I cannot point to sensor data that captures it, but I was 6 meters above that fight and I saw it, and I have never doubted what I saw, and I believe the hesitation was genuine. I believe that the thing in that canyon encountered a behavior it had not been designed to account for and needed a fraction of a second to reclassify it, and that fraction of a second was the moment I came off the rim. I did not try to stick the landing. I want to be honest about that. A clean landing from 6 meters with one arm was not a calculation I could make with favorable odds, and I did not attempt it. What I attempted was to put my weight and my saber on the predator from above at the angle that gave me the best chance of meaningful contact, and to accept whatever the landing cost me as a cost that had already been paid. I hit it. I hit it squarely from above, and both of us went into the canyon floor, and for a period that felt long and was probably under 2 seconds I had no information about anything, just stone and impact and red light and pain everywhere, and the sustained effort of not letting go of my saber. Then I was clear, 3 meters from the predator, on my back on the riverbed, looking up at the gray sky of Korreth with my lungs full of the mineral air. My saber was in my hand. I do not know how I kept hold of it through that, and I count it among the better pieces of luck in a life that has had some. The predator was on one knee. I looked to my right and Seld had gotten back to his feet. He was not steady. I could see what it cost him to be upright, the quality of control that requires more from a person than the ordinary upright posture, but he was up, and his blade was in his hand, and he was looking at me. He had that expression, the one from 10,000 training sessions, the question that wasn't a question, that was already the answer, waiting for me to catch up. Arev was a meter to his right, blade raised, still between Seld and the predator. Behind us, 200 meters south, was the transport. "Run," Seld said. He said it quietly. He said it the way he said everything in the training room, without drama, without urgency, as if the instruction were the obvious conclusion to a problem, and he was simply delivering it to save time. It was the voice of a teacher who has already thought through the problem, and knows the answer and respects you enough to give it to you directly. "Sir." "Kale." He looked at me. He looked at me the way he had looked at me across 4 years of training sessions, across every mistake I made and every question I got wrong, and every moment I found something I hadn't known I was capable of. He looked at me the way he had looked at me the day I passed my first trial, when he said nothing but put one hand briefly on my shoulder, and the meaning of that gesture took me 3 years to fully understand. "Run," he said again. And he and Arev moved at the predator. I have been asked, in various formal and informal contexts over the following 30 years, whether I considered staying, whether the training, the bond, the years invested, the faces I was leaving behind, whether any of it created in me a hesitation before I did what I did. I considered it for 3 seconds. That is an honest count. 3 seconds of consideration before I turned and ran south, which was longer than I had available and shorter than most people imagine when they hear the story. And the reason I ran at the end of those 3 seconds is that Joran Seld had looked me in the eye and told me to. And Joran Seld had spent 4 years building in me the understanding that orders given by experienced people in lethal situations carry the weight of everything the order giver knows that the order receiver does not. And that the correct response to such orders is action, not deliberation. I ran 200 meters of flat riverbed, one arm clamped against my side. Behind me I could hear the fight, and then I could hear Seld's voice, not words, just the sound a human body makes when it is giving everything it has left to a single purpose, and then I could hear nothing at all. The silence was worse than the sounds. The transport was where we had left it. I hit the ramp at a run, slapped the emergency close, went straight to the cockpit. My hands found the launch sequence before my mind had consciously authorized the search. The cross-draining cell had insisted on taking over, 4 years of procedure finding its groove in the muscle memory, while the rest of me was still somewhere in the canyon. Systems cycling, engines warming, diagnostics running across the board, with the small, efficient certainty of tools designed to be used under exactly these conditions. I was lifting off when it came around the south end of the canyon wall. It was not running. That detail arrived with a specific and nauseating quality, because by the time I had registered its position I was already at 6 meters, already off the canyon floor, already in the process of becoming unreachable by any conventional accounting. It was not running. It was moving at the measured, deliberate pace of something that has calculated the geometry of the situation and found the geometry satisfactory. As if running were a concession to urgency, and it had not yet decided that urgency was warranted. I pushed the throttle forward. The transport lurched up and north, and I was climbing, 15 meters off the floor, 20, when the force push hit the hull. It was not a warning push. It was a hammer blow from a direction the flight computer had not been designed to expect, lateral and slightly upward, catching the starboard aft at an angle that spun the nose hard to port and sent the altimeter into a brief argument with itself about what it was actually measuring. I fought the controls left-handed because my right had gone to brace on instinct when the impact came, and the left was the working arm, and I was fighting the yaw with one hand. And everything I understood about the atmospheric envelope at Korreth's altitude, and whatever the force was still willing to give me. The portside thruster caught. It caught a second before I had decided which of the rapidly narrowing options was the least bad, and the nose came up and I was climbing again, still yawing, still correcting, but climbing, and the canyon rim dropped below me, and the flat gray sky of Korreth filled the forward viewport like something that had been waiting patiently for me to arrive. I looked back once. The canyon was a dark fracture in pale stone receding. I couldn't see anything moving in it. I looked for 11 seconds, I counted, and then I turned forward and flew. The hyperspace calculation took 11 minutes. I sat in the pilot's chair and watched the counter and did not think. I was aware of the shoulder, which had settled into a deep, nauseating throb that I had no way to address until I reached a medical bay. I was aware of the empty seats at the back of the transport. I was aware, with a specificity that seemed disproportionate given everything else demanding my attention, of the card game Bren had taught me 2 days ago, the rules of which I could still recite in precise detail. I was shaking. I noted this as a physical fact and chose not to address it. The jump counter reached 0. I hit the lever. The stars went long, and then there was only the tunnel, and the sound of the drive, and the particular silence of hyperspace which is not silent at all, but which contains no other human beings. I sat in that silence for 3 hours. The journey was 7 hours total to the nearest station with a military comm relay. I sat in the pilot's chair for the first 3 before I could make myself move to do anything else. I tried to run diagnostics on the hull damage from the force push. I tried to write up a preliminary incident report, which is standard protocol, and which I got approximately 4 sentences into before I stopped, because the 4 sentences I had written were in the operational language that incident reports use, and the operational language had no words for what I was carrying. I went to the medical kit and set the shoulder as well as I could set it alone with one working arm, which was not well. I drank water. I sat on the floor of the cargo bay with my back against the wall and looked at the 4 empty packs that Seld and Arev and Bren and Ussa had left behind when we disembarked, still sitting exactly where they'd left them that morning. Dahl had his pack with him. He had been carrying it when he went down. I found later from the recovery team's report that he had been found with it still on his back, which told me something about the specific circumstances of his incapacitation, that he had not been in a position to drop weight before the end, that it had come fast. I have not decided whether that information helps. I remember thinking in the cargo bay about Bren's voice, the sustained low cursing that had reached me all the way to the transport ramp, still going, still finding breath to work with. I remember thinking, he is still there. He is still in that canyon making noise, and I'm up here in hyperspace, and there is nothing I can do about that, and I need to stay in that truth without letting it take me somewhere that removes my ability to function, because functioning is what I was sent home to do. The debriefing was formal and extensive, and I will not rehearse all of it here. What I want to record is the one exchange that has stayed with me most clearly, which occurred in the third session, when one of the senior analysts asked me whether, in my assessment, the entity had been surprised by the engagement. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered it. Not surprised, I said finally, but it encountered something it hadn't fully accounted for. The analyst looked at me. Can you be more specific? Arev Moss, I said. At the end. She kept fighting past the point where any optimization model would have stopped her. The entity hesitated. I saw it hesitate. I think it hesitated because it didn't have a response category for that behavior. The analyst wrote something, did not read it back to me. The hesitation, he said, lasted approximately how long? A fraction of a second. More writing. And you interpret that hesitation as evidence that the entity encountered something unfamiliar. I interpret it, I said, as evidence that the entity was built around a specific set of assumptions about how living beings behave under extreme pressure, and that Arev Moss violated those assumptions in a way the entity had to reclassify in real time. The analyst looked at me for a moment that was longer than the question required. Then he nodded once and moved to the next item on his list. I have thought about that exchange for 30 years. I still don't know what he wrote down. I still don't know what the senior analysts made of the Korreth data in the aggregate, or what operational conclusions they drew from it, or what the subsequent investigation confirmed or failed to confirm. What I know is what I saw and what I believe it means, and I have committed to that interpretation not because it is comforting. It is not comforting, but because I believe it is accurate. What followed was formal. There was a debrief, 12 sessions in total, full transcripts, every detail I had reconstructed treated with the thoroughness that events of that classification warranted. They had questions I could answer and questions I couldn't, and questions for which I had answers they appeared to have already expected, which told me something about what they knew going into those sessions that I was not told directly. The observation team was sent to Korreth 6 weeks later. I was not part of that team. I was not briefed on what they found, beyond a formal notification that the mission report had been updated and classified. I took the classification level, and the lack of briefing as information in themselves, the way you read a silence the same way you read a statement. The public summary of the Korreth mission reads, Scout Kadri encountered unknown hostile entity. Kadri suffered heavy casualties. Single survivor returned with intelligence. Further investigation ongoing. Ongoing. That word has kept me company for 30 years. I know what I know. Separate from the report language, separate from the briefings I received and the ones I didn't, separate from everything told to me by people with reasons to calibrate the telling, here is what I actually know. 6 of us went into that canyon, and 1 came out. What killed the others was not malice in any human framework. I have thought about this a great deal, because the human reflex when confronted with something that destroys the things you care about is to assign that destruction an emotional content, hatred, cruelty, pleasure taken in harm. The predator had none of those things. What it had was more disturbing, purpose. Complete, undiluted, perfectly calibrated purpose. A design that had been finished, actually finished. All the rough edges resolved. All the failure modes addressed, in ways that made our training feel approximate. When I hit it on the flank, it took the hit not because it failed to see it coming, but because it had weighed the hit against what the hit was going to cost me, and found the exchange favorable. We were not dealing with a living thing that made mistakes under pressure. We were dealing with something that had been made to operate without that category of error. And yet we made it hesitate. I keep returning to that. The evidence is documented, not the hesitation itself, which existed in the space of a fraction of a second and left no trace in any sensor log, but what the hesitation preceded. The recovery team's survey of the canyon found physical evidence that the predator took significant damage. Documented, measured, classified at a level I no longer have access to, but whose existence has been confirmed to me by 3 separate sources over 3 decades. In a fight against 6 trained operatives, the accounting of that damage is not consistent with a clean engagement. Something in that canyon cost it more than it had been built to expect. I know what that something was. I know because I watched it happen from 6 meters above. Erev Moss, in the last minute of her life, fighting with a simplicity that stripped out everything except the thing that mattered, the person behind her, the one she had stepped in front of, did something that a creature built entirely around calculated purpose did not have a category for. She kept going past the point where the calculation said she should stop, not because she misunderstood the calculation, but because she had decided the calculation was answering the wrong question. The predator was asking, what is the optimal outcome for this entity? She was asking, what is the person behind me worth? And those are not the same question, and they do not produce the same answers. And when a creature built around the first question encounters a being operating from the second, there is a fraction of a second where the architecture has to catch up. That is the gap I fell through. That is the reason I am here and writing this. Bren Sarrow kept breathing and cursing when everything said he should have been finished, and that noise reached me at the transport ramp, and it kept me from stopping when something in me wanted to stop. Ussa Vorn spent the best work of her career buying 8 seconds she could have preserved. Dal Rain fought until he couldn't. Joran Seld got back to his feet on a canyon floor with wounds that should have kept him down, and looked at me with the expression he wore in every training session, the one that said, "You know what to do, stop waiting for someone to tell you." Erev Moss stepped between her master and a thing that was going to kill them both, and she stayed there. And because she stayed there, the predator needed a fraction of a second to reclassify the situation. And in that fraction of a second, I came off the rim, and the impact I made from that angle changed the geometry of everything that followed, and Joran Seld got back to his feet. None of that saved them. I understand this. I have been understanding this for 30 years, and I expect to continue understanding it until I can't anymore. It didn't save them, but it cost the predator something it didn't expect to pay, and I believe I have staked 30 years of how I think about this on the belief that the cost was real, that the thing that came down that canyon wall left carrying something it didn't arrive with, not a wound exactly, something subtler. The evidence of having met a kind of opposition it was not entirely prepared for. There is a technical name for what human beings do when they fight past the point where the math has turned against them. The literature calls it various things: the will to persist, the survival instinct, the unit cohesion response. None of those terms quite captures what I watched happen on the floor of that canyon. What I watched was something more specific and harder to categorize. 5 people refusing, one after another, to finish on schedule. Not because they misunderstood what was happening. Because they understood it completely, and found it insufficient reason to stop. The predator was built to fight beings who stop when the math says stop. We are not always those beings. That is not comfort. I want to be clear about that. It does not change the accounting. Joran Seld and Erev Moss and Bren Sarrow and Ussa Vorn and Dal Rain did not walk out of that canyon, and no amount of framework building changes that fact. The memorial wall has their names, and I read those names every year on the anniversary, and I feel what I feel, which is the same thing I have been feeling for 30 years, and which does not diminish with time the way people sometimes suggest grief does. But the predator is still out there. The reports have confirmed this obliquely, over the years, through the particular silences that form around topics that intelligence services have reason to watch carefully. And it is carrying, in whatever way a thing like that carries anything, the evidence of a canyon on Korreth where 5 people made it work for what it took. Joran Seld spent 4 years teaching me to ask the right question. The right question is not whether we won. The right question is what we cost. On Korreth, against something built to be unstoppable, we cost it more than it expected to pay. We made it hesitate. We marked it. We demonstrated, for whatever it is worth in whatever archive might eventually matter, that we are not the kind of beings that finish on schedule. I never trained another Padawan. That is the truth, and I have been asked about it often enough that I should be more honest about the reason than I usually am. The reason is not that I lost faith in the mission. The reason is not despair about the gap between what training produces and what the galaxy contains. The reason is simpler and harder than either of those things. I know now, in a way I did not know before Korreth, what it costs a teacher to look a student in the eye and say, "Run." I know what it costs to give the last lesson and have it be that one. I know what it means to look at someone you have spent years building into the person they need to be, and to see in their face the 4 years you have spent together, and to say, "What I am buying for you right now is worth what it costs, go." I know how that looks from the other side. I know how it feels to carry it. I do not know if I have that in me to do to someone else. I have not found it in myself to find out. The canyon on Korreth has been standing for 30 years while I have been here. The fractured stone walls and the dry riverbed and the flat gray sky. The place where 6 people went in and 1 came out, and where the one who came out left behind something he has been trying to understand ever since. What happened there matters, not because we won, we didn't win, but because we were human beings, and human beings are not the kind of creatures that finish when they're supposed to. We stop when we're out, not before. Joran Seld understood that. He taught it to me in the only way the lesson could be taught, by doing it himself, in the final minute of his life, in a canyon on a world with a mineral-smelling atmosphere and a sky like dirty glass, in front of a thing that had been built to be finished in ways we were not. The thing is still out there, still moving, still carrying, in whatever way it carries things, a mark from that canyon that it did not arrive with and could not have anticipated. That is the accounting. It has to be enough.